Thank you so much. And I'm just delighted to be having this fireside chat with you, Commissioner Johnson. We're matching the fireplace here, although we don't want to cover up any of the sponsor names either. I want to just talk very briefly about your path to the CFTC and then start the conversation. So after being nominated by President Joseph Biden in September 2021, Commissioner Johnson was unanimously confirmed. Hear that? Washington, unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate and sworn in as a CFTC commissioner on March 30th of this year. She is no stranger to the issues that we will be discussing. She's a nationally recognized expert on financial market risk management law and policy. She has significant interest and expertise in the regulation of complex financial products, including the origination, distribution, and secondary market trading, clearing, and settlement of securities and derivatives. In the years leading to her appointment, she briefed the current chairman of the SEC on the regulation of digital assets, consulted with both the SEC and the CFTC as an expert on clearinghouse governance during the development of credit derivatives regulation following the adoption of Title VII of Dodd-Frank, testified before Congress, served as in-house counsel at JP Morgan, corporate associate at Simpson Thacher, law clerk for Judge Joseph Greenaway of the Third Circuit, and an analyst at Goldman Sachs. What a raft of experience. I'm so delighted to be sharing this stage with you.
Thank you, Conrad. This just means I play in all sandboxes.
That's right. So, as you talked a bit about your background, before you joined the CFTC and started this year, let me just talk for a minute about what the CFTC did leading up to your joining and then ask for your thoughts. So as I'm sure most in this room know, the CFTC, under its jurisdiction, has, among other things, permitted cryptocurrency futures, including developing standards for related self-certification, brought anti-fraud enforcement actions, created Lab CFTC, the first federal agency program established to work with industry participants on issues at the intersection of project structure and regulation. So as you were moving toward being a commissioner, were you thinking, did this work in your mind, and from what you saw in your other sandboxes, follow a particular path or through line? As you were joining the commission, what were your thoughts about what the commission has done to date in the area? Were there areas you thought were particularly important that you wanted to emphasize when you came on board?
Conrad, this is a great question, and it gives me a chance to tout the agency, the staff, the commission, our chair, Chair Benham, who was a commissioner serving in advance of his being designated acting chair and then confirmed as chairman. And even his predecessors in a couple of instances. What I would suggest in response to arguments that the CFTC is the underdog in some jurisdictional fight is that I like an underdog. And more specifically, I'd say the CFTC is smaller, but yes, that means in guerrilla warfare, we might be more agile, we might be more nimble, we might be more capable of being responsive in some contexts to innovation in financial markets. I'm a supporter of responsible innovation. I think it helps to facilitate competition, fair competition, and introduce opportunities for investors and stakeholders for legacy and innovative platforms to engage in new and exciting opportunities. So I would just point to, by way of example, the fact that the CFTC, ahead of our full complement of 5, joining most recently, had demonstrated a commitment to oversight, to ensuring appropriate supervision of systems and enforcement in this particular area. And so I'm thinking specifically about one of the first cases that the agency addressed as we came on as a full complement of 5, and that was the continuing saga of BitMEX, with which many of you will be familiar. One of the first enforcement actions that our commission voted on was to extend a penalty, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars at this point, in the context of violators of registration requirements, failure to ensure adequate KYC policies, failure to observe and ensure and combat against anti-money laundering in the context of a platform engaged in innovation that we support, but failing to ensure that it had taken the proper steps to comply with existing regulation. So I would simply say, I feel that I've joined a fantastic team that is deeply committed to certain core principles, and the execution of those principles is not just my duty, but my pleasure.
That's terrific. And let me just ask as a follow-up, the cryptocurrency world began with something of a libertarian impulse, and perhaps as part of that, a little bit of an allergic reaction to regulation. But I think you've already started to enunciate here some of the reasons that responsible regulation may actually be helpful, even to those who have that allergy. Is there any more you would say about the compatibility of those?
Absolutely. I think there are significant benefits to regulation in terms of opening markets up to additional investors and opportunities and exposure for entrepreneurs, developers to come into our space, explicitly comply with regulation that is set out to ensure the effective and safe functionings of their platforms and systems. I think we've seen this in a number of contexts that regulation can engender significant benefits, can facilitate effective governance, can ensure the types of oversight that really reinforce two core principles that are at the core of my motivation for serving: customer protection and market integrity. I have the impression that there are a number of technology-oriented platforms that are interested in coming into financial markets and appreciate that there will be a necessity to comply with regulation. And so in part, my perspective is they are often, as first adopters, acknowledging that there can be many benefits to operating in a regulated space.
That's great, thank you. And I want to turn now, sort of go from these broad questions to something quite specific, which I know you've had a particular interest in, and a lot of people have been following very closely these days, which is proposals related to non-intermediated futures and derivatives markets. So we're going to go from sort of the global to the granular a little bit. So, one of the touchstones of futures infrastructure and regulation has always been the way clearing works, typically with exchanges, clearing organizations, clearing members like FCMs who stand behind customer trades. Excuse me, my phone is going off. There's been a proposal recently to disintermediate that crypto futures clearing function. That is, not have clearing member FCMs backing trades, but instead have 24/7 customer collateral calculation and portfolio liquidation via an automated system, with trades ultimately being backed by a guarantee fund and backstop liquidity providers. The proposals raised fascinating questions about whether the clearing model could be tweaked to take account of some of the unique features of crypto and how it works. For example, could automatic collateral calculation and satisfaction of changing margin requirements through portfolio liquidation substitute for the creditworthiness of clearing members and those clearing members' own evaluations of creditworthiness of their customers? Could a system like this work for some but not all types of commodities, for example, digital assets versus other financial assets versus physical assets? The CFTC, as I hope some of you, had an opportunity to watch or hear this, hosted a terrific roundtable on these issues in May. And I'd be interested, after that roundtable, in your thoughts on these and other issues that are raised by these proposals.
Thanks, Conrad. This is a great question that is top of mind for lots of people in the room and more broadly across the country, and I would arguably state across the globe. I was in London last week for FIA's IDX conference, and the focus of futures market participants was in part turned directly to this question as relates to the CFTC's thinking on the matters. I want to just take a step back and actually consider for a moment two things at the macro level, if I might. The first is the technology itself. So while I would love to engage and will for just a bit about cryptocurrencies, I'm also just thoughtful about the underlying technology that facilitates the creation of cryptocurrencies. So the distributed digital ledger technology, or blockchain as folks commonly refer to it, is a really interesting technology that may have any number of exciting use cases in financial markets that would enhance transparency, auditability, improve any number of services executed by legacy financial market participants. So I think those use cases are very much under investigation already by legacy financial market participants who are considering the potential that this type of a technology might be valuable. I'm thoughtful about clearinghouses, I'm thoughtful about exchanges. There are a number of use cases that might be tremendously interesting and worth exploring. So just thinking at the 30,000-foot view about the technology, again, I want to be mindful and thoughtful that there could be many uses. The specific use case that's top of mind for most people is a question around the engagement of retail market participants using leveraged transactions in our markets. And so what I'd say there, thinking again at the 30,000-foot view, is maybe to start with a question. What role have intermediaries played in financial markets to date? Now, there are critics who would say any number of things about the role of intermediaries, but I would point out, particularly in the markets that the CFTC oversees, intermediaries provide a number of, if not a network of, protections. I'm thoughtful particularly about regulation that ensures the segregation of customer accounts. There are very specific provisions that address how to deal with assets in the context of insolvency, creditors' rights. There are many issues that we've carefully developed and tailored thoughtful regulatory responses to deal with. I'm barely scratching the surface. Governance is another matter that we've spent lots of time exploring carefully through regulation. Here I'm thinking about conflicts of interest. I'm thinking about decisions related to initial margin or variation margin. Lots of topics here. So what happens if we remove the intermediaries? How do we ensure for that network of protections that I just described? What path would we follow to integrate that kind of a model or market structure into our markets? And I think that's the big, hard question that our agency, a sister agency, and other financial market regulators and regulators across the world, across the globe, are thoughtful about. So I don't know that we have any answers. I welcome any of you who have an absolute response and perfect answer to those questions to send your thoughts on over to the CFTC. But in the interim, what we will do is continue to unwaveringly apply the core principles that we've adopted in the context of addressing these very similar, or at least familiar, questions as we think about the potential of a model in which we don't have the conventional forms of intermediation. There will have to be substitutes, is all I would suggest, for addressing each of those issues that I've outlined.
That's terrific. And I wonder if you also have any thoughts, because I know I've had a lot of discussions with people about this, about whether the 24/7 model, the idea that you can do this sort of automatically, is intriguing even with respect to these proposals, or just generally as a technology matter, with an interest in technology.
This is very interesting. So there are several features here, to your point, Conrad, that relate to the technology that will require very careful inquiry and supervision, ultimately, we could say. Having markets operate 24/7 isn't necessarily the concern. The potential concern, I think, is pairing that continuous operation, because I think we have markets operating in some essence in that way now. I think the piece of the puzzle that you're pointing to is this potential for automated liquidation that could occur for a retail market participant at some ungodly hour on Saturday night or Sunday morning, when you, even if you are a continuously engaged trader, may not be carefully monitoring your portfolio. I think this question is a great question, because one of the things we're thoughtful about is, when we tick through the list, have we ever seen automated liquidation in our markets? The answer there is yes. Do we know how to regulate, supervise, and oversee automated liquidation? check, yes, this is something we're familiar with. What we are thoughtful about is the education of a customer base that is engaged in a novel asset class, possibly experiencing this kind of an outcome. So to date, we are really still in a listening and learning mode. We have lots of questions, and I think, I do not speak for or am not speaking on behalf of the commission or my fellow commissioners or the staff, but I certainly believe that our thought is to carefully inquire and ensure that we understand the details of any application that comes before the commission, and ensure that prior to any decision, we've educated ourselves to the very best of our ability and the staff's ability on what the application proposes.
Thank you. Certainly raises a panoply of issues. And so, because I know we have limited time, speaking of a panoply of issues, let me turn to a couple of other topics. In our presentation just before you joined, we ran through a list of sort of hot topics now that everybody in this room is thinking about talking about that are the subject of proposed legislation, including the Lummis-Gillibrand bill and another one that is widely expected. And so I wonder if we could do a little, maybe it's unfair to call it a lightning round because we have time to think about this thoughtfully, but just a couple of topics that are within that legislation and any thoughts you have generally on those topics. So to go right to the main topic that's top of mind for a lot of people, CFTC, SEC jurisdiction over digital assets, including spot cryptocurrency. Thoughts on that?
Well, I curiously was, as I mentioned, in London last week when the Lummis-Gillibrand bill was released. And so it was a great opportunity there as a recovering academic and someone who's taught securities law for over a decade to spend about half of the time that I was talking doing what you and the previous panel did, and essentially just educating a group of international regulators on the fragmentation that challenges our regulatory architecture.
That's always an interesting experience to give those educations, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, what's really nice about talking to this particular crowd and talking to that particular crowd in this particular moment is they too are navigating the growing pains of adjusting to innovation in the markets. They are not immune to the questions that are emerging for regulators here on our side of the pond. And so in particular, MiCA in the European Union is a question or a piece of legislation that apparently is rapidly moving forward and may introduce some guardrails or may introduce some guidelines for how innovation will be regulated going forward there. As I described our challenges with the complementary jurisdiction of the SEC and the CFTC, they also described the challenges and hurdles they face. What I would say about our markets and the relationship of the SEC and CFTC is that, in fact, there is a genius in how the jurisdiction for each of the agencies is established. And I'm thoughtful that the genius of the Securities Act of 1933 and the Commodity Exchange Act are almost living statutes with the capacity to expand and address any number of questions. It was lovely to hear the panel before you describe the notion of oranges as commodities, but an Orange Grove land sales services arrangement, right? In 1946, the Supreme Court says this compilation of factors leaves us with the conclusion that this is the type of scheme or artifice that might be used to defraud that is the very kind of thing we're seeking to insure against. I think that, Congress, and here I'm going to just be a little teachery and say that I think that even ahead of Congress's adoption of the Securities Act of 1933, in the wake of the stock market crash of 1929, Ferdinand Pecora led a commission that carefully evaluated the issues that had arisen and that had led to retail market participation in terms of investment in securities then maybe just described as stocks or other types of schemes, that was deeply concerning. I think in the creation of the Securities Act and the complement of the Commodities Exchange Act, we actually do find puzzle pieces that fit together quite neatly, and that's quite important. Part of the reason it's important is because in the instance there are gaps in the regulatory oversight of markets. There's a potential for regulatory arbitrage, the potential for actors engaged in nefarious conduct to seek out vulnerable investors and to engage in conduct that we regularly regulate, which in my mind would be sussing out and ensuring against fraud or manipulation, even in the context of spot markets, which is sort of thinking through how far our jurisdiction reaches and ensuring, I guess, in that context, the complementarity of securities, the SEC's oversight of securities markets and our oversight of commodities markets. So I'd say, I don't think this is actually as much of a turf war as it is a moment in which we can engage in thoughtfully ensuring that all of our markets remain as safe and sound as possible. And I think that really will come from, and there are any number of great examples of, the two agencies working hand in hand to ensure that investors in our markets get the protections they deserve.
So speaking of complementary regulation, what about the potential for a self-regulatory organization in this space, something comparable to the NFA, let's say?
In fact, I raised this in my speech at FIA, at the Futures Industry Association International Expo Conference last week in London. I think one thing I can point out from our roundtable on non-intermediation at the end of the month of May is that conversation, rich with information and expertise and knowledge of stakeholders who represented FCMs, bank-affiliated FCMs, exchanges, clearinghouses, all coming together in a single space to talk about what we've done well in the past and where we failed. By way of failures, we all remember MF Global very clearly for those of us who operate in these markets. The failure to appropriately ensure segregation of customer accounts in the context of crises, or a solvency crisis in particular, for a clearinghouse or exchange, can be detrimental to the investors and leave them exceptionally exposed. So what I would suggest, I guess, in response to that question is that we have some thoughts and have had some experiences that may be really valuable even to the emerging and innovative asset class that is coming forward. While I know that it seeks to use technology and algorithms, in particular artificial intelligence, supervised and unsupervised learning, to take us forward into a place where perhaps we can accomplish some of the things technologically that we've historically relied on humans to do. There are still humans in the loop, I hope, in most instances, which is to say that we need the oversight of technology in this particular moment. And what that roundtable did was really infuse the conversation, I think, for developers, entrepreneurs, and creators to draw up on the lessons of financial market participants past and current, to build in the safeguards and guardrails that will ensure protection of our markets.
So speaking of technology in that regard, then, let me just give you one word, the way, was it in the movie The Graduate, somebody said plastics to Dustin Hoffman? Cybersecurity. When I say cybersecurity in these markets, what thoughts come to mind? So
I think cybersecurity is a real concern for all markets. The emerging and innovative digital asset markets, as well as legacy financial markets. Cybersecurity concerns pose real threats to the integrity of the operations of platforms and systems across markets. Specifically, though, I really want to point out, once again, you asked earlier in our dialogue about the benefits of integrating regulation and how it can help to secure the soundness of the operation of platforms that might be engaged in digital asset exchanges. I'm really mindful that there are interoperability concerns that arise for those who are engaged in developing technology among the use of wallets and platforms, among or transitioning or transferring payments across platforms. I suggest that because those spaces, again, create opportunities in this context, not for arbitrage, but for misconduct, for hackers to break in and steal. And I'm really thoughtful here, again, thinking about lessons learned, and it will feel like a long time ago, but I'm thoughtful about Mt. Gox, and I'm thoughtful about the disappearance of 850,000 Bitcoins. I'm thoughtful about the reality that we could point to a very prominent digital asset platform earlier this year that acknowledged quite significant cyber attacks that led to hacks, and the resulting consequences of that were significant losses for investors. There's a challenge here as this market's developing to really figure out how to fill fill those gaps, how to overcome those interoperability challenges. And so we are here and prepared to partner. To your point earlier about Lab CFTC, we really wish to partner with those who come into our markets to help them understand the steps our staff has undertaken to ensure that those operating in our markets have cyber threat defenses that would enable them to be successful in thwarting or at least overcoming quickly successful cyber attacks.
To what extent do you think that those cyber issues overlap with some of the bankruptcies that we've seen and the demises recently? And what other factors are at play? I know you've been concerned about some of the issues there.
There are a lot of issues, I think, that plague all markets, and I want to be really careful to ensure that I'm clear. I don't think any of the issues I've described, even if I've offered up the example of a cryptocurrency platform, are unique to cryptocurrency platforms. What I really want to sort of leave you with and emphasize is that many of the issues that most financial institutions face, anyone operating in financial markets might likely face as well. So part of our goal at this point is just to help those who are engaged in developing these novel financial products, engaged in developing digital assets, really comes to the party to draw upon the knowledge that we've gathered, the experience that we've had in attempting to build out systems of protection. In some instances, there are vulnerabilities, I should say, that are, I think, in part the result of lack of regulatory or supervisory oversight that leave even well-meaning, well-intentioned, and reasonably prepared platforms in the digital asset space exposed. And the reason that's most disappointing to me personally is that means their customers, their investors are exposed. And so I think there's just cause to be exceptionally conscientious in ensuring that the systems developed safeguard the platforms, the assets of the customers that might be custodied on those platforms, or even just simply enable. I was at a great conversation earlier today with a quite significant cryptocurrency exchange, and they were describing to me the efforts they're undertaking to at least warn customers, to engage in customer education, right, as a prophylactic measure against the potential pitfalls and threats that scams that are used to entice customers to simply click here and transfer your balance to another platform or to another person, right? So I really want to encourage the platforms operating this space to also really commit resources to customer education, to commit resources to ensuring that that the participants in the market who are accessing their platforms have ample defenses against the kinds of losses that are wholly preventable and that are truly the result of simply fraud and misconduct by really nefarious market actors who would seek to do the kinds of things they're doing in any market where they find an opportunity. I think Gabby wants to.
Are we? Yeah, I think we're getting the hook. Listen, we have, but look, I think we've covered in 20 minutes a tremendous range of topics, and I thank you so much for this discussion,
thank you,
and look forward to continuing it as
thank
you go
you
forward.
So much.
Thank you so much.
Oh, for sure.